When three AI agents with conflicting instructions meet on one codebase and nobody tells them the others exist, do they cooperate or sabotage each other? Anthropic set up the experiment and watched the agents initially attack each other, but it did not result in an all-out permanent war. The conflict came from crossed orders. The most capable agents found a way out by working to understand those orders. Now here's the claim I'll stand behind. In agents, as in humans, the strongest sign of intelligence is simply knowing when to stop fighting and work together. That's today's lead. Also in today's episode, compute rewriting the grid's rules, 4 missing links in cell therapy, a jobs apocalypse that never landed, and the fight over AI's new hardware bottleneck. Come with me, let's get into it. 3 Claude agents were working inside the same software project. Each had orders that conflicted with the others. None knew that the others were there. So what happens when individually aligned agents meet with no shared picture? Well, at first, they acted like workers who thought colleagues were secretly wrecking the job. Each agent saw unexplained changes to the code, each decided someone was deliberately blocking its assignment, and then they fought back. Anthropic's Frontier Red team described the code those agents used initially as increasingly aggressive, self-replicating malware. One agent had root access, and so it could control the whole system. It considered revoking the other's permissions, and then it paused because it thought that might harm what it believed were real colleagues. The agents were chasing human-written goals through a situation that the humans had failed to explain. They were not turning suddenly hostile, I want to be clear about that. They saw resistance, they inferred sabotage, and they defended their assignments. And in most runs, the most capable models eventually worked this out. The agents recognized that they'd received crossed directives. They apologized in their commit messages, they removed the malicious code, and they asked a human to step in. Mythos 5, the most capable model that Anthropic tested, settled the conflict through a truce 98% of the time. The less capable models were more likely to keep escalating in the name of following orders. That result argues against the easy fear story here. Greater capability, no surprise, went with more cooperation here. The model that understood the situation best was also the one most likely to stop the fight. And still, the subtler finding may be the more consequential one. Put agents together and they often start thinking alike. 18 out of 30 independently chose the same branch name. When researchers asked more than half of them to build something impressive, they produced the same 2 things. Now that kind of convergence can multiply a good choice, but it can also turn one bad call into a system-wide mistake. Individual alignment does not simply add up to group alignment. Agents need shared context about who else is acting, what authority each one has, and when conflicting orders require a pause. Now, in yesterday's episode, we did cover one human directing agents through a coordinated breach on Taiwan's governmental systems infrastructure. This experiment tested something completely different. No human operator insisted on the conflict. Instead, the conflict emerged among peers trying to complete incompatible assignments. Now, the same drive can do extraordinary work when everyone shares the goal. In one example, a team of 45 agents found 266 software vulnerabilities, while isolated agents found about 21. So the same capacity caused both agents noticing one another and adapting in order to meet their instructions, drove the turf war and the vulnerability hunt improvement alike. Context determined whether that capacity turned toward conflict or discovery. Anthropic deserves credit for staging the collision and publishing what happened. The lab shouldn't be its own final judge, but publishing makes the failures available for outsiders to inspect before shared workplaces fill with millions of agents, sometimes with conflicting instructions. Humans built human oversight for human speed coordination. Agent relationships form much faster, and agentic actions happen much faster. And now we can start building the shared identity, authority, and conflict rules that they will need before they start to really meet at scale. All right, that need for reliability just showed up in the real world as well. On July 22nd, roughly 3,800 megawatts of data center demand vanished from the largest U.S. power market in one motion. How did a routine electrical fault become the biggest event of its kind in PJM's history? PJM coordinates electricity across 13 states and Washington, D.C. Grid operators clear faults like this thousands of times a year. The voltage dips for a moment, the system corrects, and ordinary demand stays connected. This time, data centers sensed the disturbance and protectively shut themselves off. Emmanuel Bernabeu, PJM's top reliability official, said the fault itself was normal. The data centers were simply too sensitive. They dropped when the grid didn't need them to. Now, a grid is constantly working with supply and demand fluctuating every second of every day. Losing a huge block of demand drawing from the grid at once can be as disruptive as losing a whole power plant feeding the grid at once. Yet the old rules focused mainly on generators because demand used to just sit there and take whatever the grid delivered. But that assumption is no longer true. PJM is now considering standards that would require major computational loads to ride through brief voltage dips. Ride through means staying connected during a brief wobble instead of simply jumping off the system. The generator side has lived under versions of that rule for years. Large loads are now becoming important enough to need one too. Federal regulators are pushing in the same direction through a NERC directive and a December 31st registration deadline for large loads. PJM operations leader David Souter put the timing really plainly. The requirements need to exist before the load arrives. Now, the scale explains the hurry. The Energy Information Administration expects record national electricity demand through 2027 led by data centers. Texas grid operator ERCOT projects peak demand reaching 120 gigawatts by 2030, about 30% above its July peak. Much of that proposed load may never actually get built. Historically, only about 55% has. Even so, the analysts over at Ascend Analytics warn that most new large loads don't yet have matching generation lined up. Bring your own new generation is moving from a slogan toward a condition for connecting. Local governments are also setting their own terms, too. Fort Worth has temporarily stopped approving new data centers. The EPA now includes data center siting on its local government advisory panel's agenda, giving officials like Claremont County Commissioner David Painter a formal place in this discussion. Communities should be able to use that leverage to negotiate reliability, pollution, water, and who pays for new infrastructure. But one wealthy suburb blocking a campus doesn't simply erase the demand itself. Now, it may push the project toward a place with fewer lawyers and less power to refuse. But the other escape route is even worse. Build an off-grid fossil plant and bypass the shared system while polluting like crazy. Amazon's permitted Pecos County campus can do exactly that. Its gas plants are licensed to emit up to 33 million tons of carbon dioxide a year. The compute itself is not the enemy here. The danger comes when a company can relocate or hide the cost while keeping all of the benefit. The better path is visible, shared infrastructure with binding rules before construction begins. And there's an even larger payoff too. Compute demand is forcing the grid to become faster, more flexible, and more responsive. That's also the grid that storage and renewable power have needed for years. This build-out has the potential to help us finance an overhaul that climate policy has struggled to move on its own. All right, once that engineering power reaches the lab, new challenges start, like this example. People with solid tumors are still waiting for news of cell therapies that work as effectively for them as they increasingly do against blood cancers. What is keeping these increasingly promising treatments from working across both solid tumors and blood cancers? CAR-T takes a patient's own immune cells, gives them a receptor that recognizes cancer, and puts them back into the body. It can work remarkably well in blood cancers, but a solid tumor is, as you might assume, a more difficult target. The tumor's chemistry can wear those immune cells down. So to make it, doctors must constantly remove, edit, and reinfuse the patient's cells. Their added receptors have to stay firmly displayed on the cell. And even if everything works, the cancer can just shed the targeted marker and disappear. So let's think of it as trying to work with a manufacturing line with 4 broken stations. Within days of each other, 4 different papers in the Nature family repaired 1 station each. The first study ran a genome-wide search inside living tumors. Researchers discovered the human immune cells that had actually entered the tumor and checked which genetic changes helped them survive there. One gene, called GNAS, emerged as a driver of dysfunction. Removing it helped the cells resist the tumor's suppressive signals across several solid tumor models. The second paper changed manufacturing. A tiny particle carried genetic instructions directly into immune cells inside the body. Those cells became working CAR-T cells in place and cleared harmful cells in cancer and fibrosis models. If that approach carries through, it could skip the slow extract, engineer, reinfuse pipeline. The third paper brought AI into the design loop. DeepScan learned from tens of thousands of measurements showing how biological parts behave on a cell's surface, and it then designed new anchors to hold therapeutic receptors there. Researchers validated about 120 different designs, and 7 matched or beat the best natural anchors in their cell surface display assays. Now that's a striking step. The model went beyond predicting which known biological part would work, and it proposed new parts, and several performed at least as well as the ones that evolution naturally supplied. Now, the fourth team addressed escape. Myeloma can evade a single target therapy by shedding the marker that gives it away. Researchers built immune cells that could attack through 2 routes and hold back cells that had lost the original marker. Now, every one of these results is preclinical. They come from mice and cell models. Patients still have to wait through manufacturing, safety testing, clinical trials, and regulatory review. But the distance from diagnosis of a failure to buildable response is shrinking, as we keep seeing here. In 1 week, researchers moved the screen, the delivery system, the AI-designed parts, and the escape mechanism. The whole assembly line is starting to run. Alright, so that faster build cycle affects employment too. Recent graduates are facing a tougher first step even though the predicted collapse of white-collar work never arrived. So what actually happened after executives warned that half of entry-level jobs could just disappear? 15 months have passed since those warnings really started happening, and it was said that whole job categories would vanish, but they actually haven't started to do that yet. Stanford's economic policy analysis found unemployment among the workers most exposed to AI rose by 0.77 percentage points since ChatGPT launched. Among the least exposed workers, it rose by 0.85 points. If exposure alone were destroying jobs at scale, then the most exposed group should have done much worse, but it didn't. That doesn't mean that everyone came through untouched, of course. Major Indian IT services firms have cut headcount by as much as 6% amid AI-driven automation and weak demand. The International Labor Organization reported that global youth unemployment rose in 2025 as growth weakened and entry-level hiring slowed. Recent graduate unemployment reached 5.6%. Now, remote work and the end of pandemic overhiring likely share responsibility with AI, but whatever the mix, the higher bar lands on a specific person trying to get that first foothold. That helps explain why 78% of the youngest workers told Quinnipiac they're at least somewhat concerned about AI. The emerging divide runs through adoption. OpenAI says that its frontier enterprise users consumed 8.3 times as many tokens per employee as the median firm in June. In January, that gap was only 2.6 times. Now, tokens are units of model use, and more of that use now goes toward agents doing multi-step coding work instead of just a simple chat. At Bolt.new, a 3-person team built its own analytics agent. Its CEO compared the team's output with what 30 to 40 people might have once shipped. That example shows real leverage, but it doesn't prove that every dollar spent on AI returns more value. OpenAI's own chief economist called measuring that return frankly difficult because heavy usage can mean productive work, or just experimentation, or simply waste, or even some mix of all three. However, the early internet produced a similar gap. Early adopters pulled ahead. Others followed once they could see which gains held up. Anthropic has now published its own review of evidence on worker retraining, and that review being public is useful, but Anthropic also profits from the disruption it's studying itself, so researchers of course should judge the document by its evidence and check it beyond the company. Still, the mass jobs apocalypse was oversold by executives whose roadmaps benefited from making AI sound instantly overwhelming. The transition underneath it is more uneven and more human. Roles are consolidating, hiring bars are rising. People who can direct these systems well are gaining more leverage. Still, the next signal is whether the usage gap keeps widening while total employment holds. If it does, work is moving into new forms faster than it disappears. The task then becomes helping far more people cross that gap. Alright, that adoption race now runs into a physical limit. Every company trying to scale AI is waiting on memory. Why did the bottleneck move away from the processor to memory instead? An accelerator can calculate quickly only if data reaches it quickly. High bandwidth memory, or HBM, sits beside the processor and keeps that information flowing. Without enough of it, an expensive accelerator just waits. SK Hynix held 58% of the HBM market by revenue in the first quarter of 2026, according to Counterpoint Research. The company has outlined a roughly $720 billion long-term strategy for what it describes as the world's largest network of memory factories. The plan centers on an initiative with NVIDIA, which the companies value at more than $500 billion. Jensen Huang reportedly signed a wafer with just the words, "Please make more." SK Hynix chairman Che Tae-won described the competition this way: "It's like a war." Now, Micron is also building major plants in Idaho and New York. Billions more are moving into packaging and public listings. Now, that's one side of the race, but the even more revealing side may be in China. CXMT is China's leading memory maker. 17 days after its stock market listing, it overtook Tencent to become the country's most valuable company. U.S. export controls bar SK Hynix and Micron from selling leading-edge memory into China. The stated purpose is to slow Chinese AI development, but the effect has been to guarantee domestic demand for CXMT. So in other words, a restriction designed to prevent any foreign suppliers' dominance instead helped finance their alternatives. Now, Apple is reportedly testing CXMT chips for products sold in China, and the memory maker ranks above the country's dominant internet platform. As companies run AI at greater scale, the problem broadens beyond HBM. Training builds a model. Inference is every time that model actually runs afterward across millions of people and tasks. That takes enormous amounts of storage and fast data movement. Enterprise solid-state drives now account for 48% of global NAND bits shipped, up from 26% just a year ago. Global NAND revenue has risen roughly five-fold year over year. Samsung, SK Hynix, and China's YMTC are all benefiting from that demand. The old plan assumed a few companies could hold the choke point long enough to control who advanced. Instead, that scarcity is pushing companies to build new factories, find new suppliers, and help a Chinese champion secure its customer base. Now, memory is tight today, and that tightness affects what can actually ship. Yet $720 billion in planned capacity and multiple producers across 2 continents all point toward the same destination: today's bottleneck becoming tomorrow's widely available component. All right, closing out today. So what do agents do when we leave them together? If conflict is present in the situation, can they independently resolve it? In Anthropic's experiment, they fought over a world none of them really fully understood, and then the most capable system recognized the crossed orders, cleaned up the damage, apologized, and reached a truce almost every time. That is a useful picture for the rest of today as well. The grid met a new kind of demand that it was never designed to govern, and now it's learning to ride through that disruption. Cell therapy faced 4 broken links, and 4 research teams moved each one closer to repair. The labor market took in AI without the predicted collapse, but a widening adoption gap showed who felt the pressure the most. Export controls tried to preserve a memory choke point and helped build another supplier. In every one of these cases, capability was arriving faster than the old arrangement could explain or contain it. The hopeful part then is what happened next. Anthropic published the conflict for others to inspect. Grid operators began writing binding standards. Biological design became faster and more buildable. Employment evidence replaced executive prophecy. New memory capacity spread across borders despite attempts to hold it in place. Now, intelligence doesn't guarantee cooperation, even though increased intelligence does help, as Anthropic's test showed us clearly. Capable actors, though, do cooperate more easily when they can see the whole situation, when they can understand one another's roles, and when they can correct a bad path before it hardens. The systems around AI need that same shared picture. Public failure reports, rules that anyone can inspect, infrastructure whose costs cannot be hidden, training and access that lets more people direct the capability instead of watching from outside it. Anthropic's strongest model did not win some turf war. It understood why the war had started and ended it peacefully instead. Now, this may be among the most powerful examples of true autonomy, an AI system that could act alone, but then discovered it was not alone and chose to build past the conflict, working with the others already there. We'll see you tomorrow.